I just found 20 excellent but underrated movies you can catch for free right here on YouTube. I've also gone through the trouble to list where else you can stream these movies if you don't want to deal with the YouTube ads. But again, these are all totally free on YouTube with links in the top pinned comment so you can start watching them right away. Thanks to Factor for sponsoring another video, but first let's start at the bottom of this list with The Conspiracy, a movie that will definitely appeal to people who are into conspiracy theories of any kind, especially if you know anything about Bohemian Grove. This movie is an attempt at a found footage thriller based on something fictional that's definitely inspired by Bohemian Grove. Now, you do have to be very patient with this movie. It's got a slow lead up, but there is a payoff at the end. But because this movie is really only for very patient conspiracy theory enthusiasts, we'll move on to Ladder 49. Obviously, a movie about firemen is going to have something in common with Backdraft, but this one's a little bit more straight down the middle. In fact, it's fairly family friendly and not quite as edgy as Backdraft. John Travolta's alright in it, but you've got a young Joaquin Phoenix before he was really hitting his stride. Still very good in a movie like this. But if you're interested in a movie about firemen, again, this one's straight down the middle, fairly wholesome, and well-rounded as well. Now for a thriller with some twists and turns that I found to be pretty exceptional, we've got Helen Hunt in I See You. Now, the less you know about this one, the better. I can't say too much because this movie's filled with several surprises. But an indie thriller like this that has a unique concept, something I've never seen in a movie before, is definitely going to earn big points from me. And this movie did that. It's not an amazing blow-your-hair-back production, but the core concept and ultimately the delivery I thought were all pretty excellent. Next up, I've got kind of a sexy one. It's titled The Escort. The main character is a professional escort, and the movie itself is kind of a romantic comedy, but she's beginning to fall for a guy who is a sex addict, and believe it or not, they're not actually having sex with each other. He's doing a story on her, he's interested in her lifestyle, she's kind of interested in his bizarre lifestyle, and it is. This movie's kind of graphic at times, but it's also very sweet, charming, and funny. It's an odd mix. Next up, we've got Legion with Paul Bettany, which is a visually stunning movie. It's dark, it's creepy, and really has got all these religious elements that are just almost too cool for school in this movie. It's a really slick flick, but not a great one. Like, the storytelling's not amazing or anything like that. If you're looking at the trailer here, you know exactly what you're signing up for. In fact, this movie has a lot in common with another Paul Bettany movie titled Priest, which was just featured on my most recent video about movies on Tubi. But another one that is just an absolute visual feast is Cool World, starring Brad Pitt and an animated Kim Basinger. And as hot as Kim Basinger was in the 90s, somehow they made an animated version of her that's like 10 times hotter. Think, Jessica Rabbit crossed with Kim Basinger. It's kind of mind-blowing stuff. The movie itself, again, it's not a masterpiece, but, fans of Brad Pitt, this is a must-watch in his filmography because of how bizarre and unique it is. And just like Who Framed Roger Rabbit, this one's kind of charmingly weird. A lot of the stuff in this animated world that he gets dropped into is strange, but it's also strange in just kind of that wacky 90s kind of way. And then because I'm showing you where else you can stream these movies, my next pick, while you can watch it as a long movie right here on YouTube, they also turned Australia into a mini-series only available on Hulu, where the title has changed to Faraway Downs. But either way you watch it, this is a big, epic movie that takes place in Australia. You've got Hugh Jackman and Nicole Kidman. Both of them are great. This is directed by Baz Luhrmann, most famous for Moulin Rouge, The Great Gatsby, most recently Elvis. And Australia is the lowest rated movie in his relatively short filmography. It's still a solid pick, it's just a bit overlong and a little loose. It's not glued together perfectly, which is why I think it makes a better miniseries than it does a movie. So if you're the least bit interested and you have Hulu, I actually recommend pursuing this movie over there. But if you don't, again, totally free to watch on YouTube, and again, a beautiful movie. Now my next pick, despite featuring an all-star cast, we're talking Brad Pitt, Julia Roberts, James Gandolfini, It suffered from negative reviews, and I think it was because when the Mexican was released, it was marketed all wrong. This came out the same year as Ocean's 11, and I think they tried to book it as something somewhat similar, and it is not. The story here is actually fairly unique, and this is directed by Gore Verbinski, who's one of the more visually stunning directors working today. He's done Pirates of the Caribbean, Mouse Hunt, A Cure for Wellness, and I will say the Mexican does kind of seem like a Steven Soderbergh flick, like Ocean's 11, but it's got a different flavor, a flavor I actually like quite a bit more, and even though some of its storytelling is loose, it more than makes up for a handful of flaws with stunning cinematography, a compelling and unusual story. There's a lot to love with the Mexican, again, if you go into it with the right expectations. Now, we're creeping up on my top 10 for this list, but my next pick was actually turned into a sci-fi remake with Hugh Jackman, but prior to that, Over the Top is a Sylvester Stallone movie about an arm wrestling championship. So the plot for this movie is he's a truck driver driving across the country competing in arm wrestling competitions where he takes his estranged son with him. They essentially turn that exact same plot into real steel decades later. And while this is not an excellent movie, the concept of a father-son Stallone movie about arm wrestling is as charming as it sounds. Like, you get exactly what you expect from this movie. Nothing more, nothing less. But I will say, fans of Stallone, this is kind of a must-see in his filmography. And then one of my all-time favorite spoofs ever made. There are better ones, I know there are, but as a sucker for some of the best gangster movies of all time, whether it be The Godfather or Goodfellas, I absolutely love Mafia. Apparently this one's also titled Jane Austen's Mafia in some countries, but Lloyd Bridges stars in this, Christina Applegate, Jay Moore, and it references all the best gangster movies. The more you know about classic gangster movies, whether it be Casino or more obscure stuff, you're gonna get all the jokes in this movie, and they're absolutely hilarious.
Hi, Joey. Anthony's told me so much about you. Psychopath, right? Hey. Oh, he seems so nice, honey.
Just as a reminder, I know I've said it, but these movies are available other places. My next pick is a great example because you can watch alone on YouTube, Netflix, Hulu, Freevee, or Roku, whatever's most convenient for you. And this is just an excellent boilerplate style thriller. You follow a woman who begins to suspect she's being followed by this real creep, and what's so great about Alone is she doesn't make stupid decision after stupid decision. She actually makes the best decision at times, and then still ends up in a terrible, terrible situation. The movie's got tense moment after tense moment. And even though the production feels fairly small, you're locked in with this woman. You're rooting for her to escape, even though you don't know much about her really at all. The movie's still very effective in terms of being a good thriller. And even though most of it's fairly slow-paced and tense, there is a big payoff with this one as well. In fact, this movie was my #1 pick on a somewhat recent list of Netflix thrillers. It's that good, and we've still got a lot to get through on this list. But before that, I do want to tell you about how I've been using today's sponsor, Factor, to get in some of the best shape of my life. It's no secret I've been working out the past few years, but I've also been eating right, and Factor has been a big help in that department. And that's because Factor lets me skip meal planning, grocery shopping, chopping, prepping, cooking, cleaning, with their fresh, never frozen meals delivered directly to your door. Each week, you get to pick from up to 30 chef-crafted meals that are designed to help support a healthy lifestyle, whether that be protein plus, vegan and veggie, low-calorie meals, or more wholesome options. I go for protein plus with meals like this Peruvian-style chicken, garlic mushroom chicken thighs. They even have a handful of chili-related options like this spicy poblano beef bowl. I mean, I'm often enjoying my Factor meal more than more expensive takeout food. I mean, you know how it is. When you're in a tight situation and you need a quick meal, rarely is that going to be something healthy, but having these on hand has been a major factor in my fitness lately. To get 50% off your first box with Factor, go to factor75.com and use my code FlickConnection50. You're also going to save 20% off your next Factor box. It's a great discount. Again, to get it, go to factor75.com, use that code FlickConnection50. Again, you'll get 50% off your first box and 20% off your second. It's a great deal, but speaking of great stuff, let's talk about the top 10 movies on this list. Believe it or not, I strongly recommend the third installment in the Riddick series, simply titled Riddick. Now, I love the first one. It's pitch black. That is also included on YouTube for free right now. And so is the Chronicles of Riddick, the second one, which I really did not enjoy. I feel like it tried to do too much of a world-building Star Wars thing. And the two movies that bookend this trilogy are smaller in scale, and I think it works so much better. In this one, you follow Riddick again, trapped on a hostile planet, and you get to see his survival skills. There's a group of, commandos that come in, and it feels like a classic sci-fi horror movie. There's so many great elements to this, and it makes fantastic use of the Riddick character, which again, I don't think the second movie did very well at all. This movie just oozes monster effects, sci-fi stuff, and honestly, one of Vin Diesel's best characters. So I would say if you enjoy Pitch Black and maybe didn't enjoy the other one or passed on it, I still strongly recommend Riddick. Just in time for Halloween, they added Nothing But Trouble, a movie that I think is just insanely underrated. For some reason, this movie did not do well.
I didn't think that any of the stuff was funny at all. I was stunned by this picture.
The world in this movie, the visual world, is so aggressively ugly.
Yes, it is ugly.
That if it isn't a funny movie, which it isn't, then you're looking at the screen and you're just repelled by the images.
And I do get it is weird and even kind of gross and off-putting multiple times throughout the movie, but this too is a comedy that's loosely based on like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I love that. Just in its concept, but then you get Chevy Chase and Demi Moore, who are both great together, but Dan Aykroyd steals the show as this crazy judge character with this insane makeup. The movie itself actually has an interesting backstory. Dan Aykroyd actually wrote and directed it, and the budget on this movie kept creeping up. They just kept spending more and more money on the production design, and when you watch the movie, you can see why. Every set is just saturated with crap. There's just so much stuff in this house, and I believe the movie flopped. I think they way overspent on this thing, and it just did not do well because people weren't as interested in a funny Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or at least it had a much smaller audience than the budget warranted. But it's a 1991 movie. Here we are over 30 years later, and I think this still holds up as an excellent comedy for horror fans. Now, speaking of horror, I've got an interesting sci-fi movie with a bunch of horror elements titled The Signal. Now, this is a fairly low-budget movie. It's got a role from Lawrence Fishburne, but you don't actually see him too much in this flick. But you get a major twist very early on in this story. You follow a young man who is following a mysterious signal. When he gets to where the signal is coming from, he wakes up to a huge surprise. He's actually being held prisoner in a facility and only being fed little pieces of information, and he's trying to figure out what's going on. And as you go deeper and deeper down this rabbit hole, and it is a rabbit hole type of a movie, the things that are happening outside of this facility, or at least outside of the few rooms he's allowed to be in, becomes a wild concept that actually is delivered in a visually stunning way, surprisingly stunning for a movie at this budget level. Next up, we've got what I think is the most underrated movie Zack Snyder ever directed, and it's an animated, family-friendly movie about owls titled The Legend of the Guardians. And what's so great about this is it's just oozing that beautiful, just absolutely gorgeous Zack Snyder style. Some of his more recent movies, I feel like they just go for style over substance, but Legends of the Guardians has both. It's got a very substantive story, and then again, just because it's all computer graphics, every single frame of this movie looks amazing. For an animated movie, this one is so good and so mature in its themes and its storytelling that I recommend this for adults to watch without kids, but if you've got children, this is a movie that will easily entertain you as much as it does them, maybe more so. Now, just before we creep into the top 5 movies on this list, we've got one of James Gandolfini's last gangster flicks that also happens to star Tom Hardy in The Drop. This also comes from the same writer behind Mystic River and Shutter Island. Tom Hardy plays a guy who runs a bar in New York where the mob drops off their money. It's basically where they launder some of it, and one night when the Drop gets robbed, he suddenly gets sucked into this plot that digs deep into the past of the neighborhood. You've got so many great characters in this beyond those two. I would say, just like Mafia, if you love the gangster movie genre, this is a great one, but it's not a hard-hitting one. In fact, it's slow-paced and simmering, but it's just incredibly well done. In fact, in terms of quality, I do think it's better than my next pick, but my next pick just managed to be a bit more entertaining, even though it too is a somewhat similar crime thriller with The Hollow Point. Now, this takes place on a border town and actually revolves around trafficking of like hollow point ammunition. Cop killers, as they're sometimes put. But that's not really the point of the movie. This plays out much more like a modern day Western, very much like No Country for Old Men. Patrick Wilson plays a new sheriff in a small town. You know, it's a setup you've heard before, but this movie hits way harder than I expected. It's much more brutal. The Hollow Point also stars Ian McShane and John Leguizamo in like one of my favorite roles I've seen him do in a long time. Jim Belushi is even in the mix in a pretty cool role. Don't expect to see him on screen much, but I did love what he brought to the table with this one. And this is the type of movie I really love recommending here. You know, it's a solid thriller that just didn't get enough love back when it released, and now it kind of floats around on free streaming services. It's been on Netflix, it's been on a bunch of stuff. You can catch it right here on YouTube right now. Believe it or not, a romantic comedy made my number 4 spot on this list. Longtime subscribers know I don't recommend romantic comedies very often, mainly because they end up being the same movie over and over again for the most part, with some exceptions, my next pick being one of the best exceptions with Mr. Right. This stars Sam Rockwell, one of my all-time favorite actors, and Anna Kendrick. The twist here is that he plays a hitman, almost like a John Wick style hitman, one where every bullet just seems to miss him, and it works to great comedic effect in this movie, mainly because Sam Rockwell's just awesome. In fact, I would say if you were disappointed by Argyle the way I was, this is a much better romantic comedy that he stars in, where he's also a badass. You get a lot of the same elements, yet Mr. Right manages to be charming and interesting, whereas Argyle was just kind of like confounding and irritating. But the humor is on point, the concept makes their relationship interesting and different enough to warrant a very high recommendation on a list of what I think are some bangers. Speaking of bangers, my next pick is easily the most recognized movie on this list. In fact, I would hesitate to even call it underrated, but I don't think I've seen Ransom available to stream anywhere, maybe ever, and it's free on YouTube right now. I will say, even if you feel like you've seen this movie, I promise you, it holds up today way better than you would expect. It's got so many fantastic, high production value, high quality scenes with some great acting, and this is a remake of a movie by the same name from 1956 that actually starred Leslie Nielsen as the hostage negotiator. Just a little tidbit of fun information for you there. Again, just a solid flick, bunch of great tension, couple scenes of action. If it's been a while since you've seen Ransom, you're gonna have a hard time finding a better thriller that's free to watch on any platform right now. But my next pick is based on a very famous book, and I think that they brought it to life beautifully in The Count of Monte Cristo. If you don't know this story, either read the book or watch this movie. It really does tell the story quite well. I will say in terms of a movie though, it does feel a bit dated, it does feel a bit slow as a result, but if you can be patient, this story has such a fantastic payoff. If you know the story, then you know what I'm talking about, but on top of all that, you get some fantastic sword fights. In fact, the sword fight at its climax, I think, warrants its placement here on the list. Everything else leading up to it's great. High production value, you got great performances from Jim Caviezel and Guy Pearce. A young Henry Cavill even has a fairly short-lived role in this movie. And while I'm a fan of movies during this time period, The Count of Monte Cristo was a book by Alexandre Dumas, who also did The Three Musketeers. And since it's the only real comparison I can make, I would say I like The Count of Monte Cristo a lot more than any of the Three Musketeers movies, and I, thought the one from the 90s was pretty good. But my number one pick is an indie flick from a director who just didn't do a whole lot else after this worth talking about, but there's just still something so unique and magical about Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And part of it is the core story of these people who are trying to forget one another with the use of this new technology. Part of it are the really incredible performances from both Kate Winslet and, maybe a career best for Jim Carrey, just in terms of dramatic, heavy performances. But the real star of this movie is the director, Michel Gondry. Not only did he tell this very bizarre Charlie Kaufman story very well, I think maybe better than any other directors have told a story written by Charlie Kaufman, but he also did it in this visual way with, I hate to even say practical effects. They're camera tricks and simple things that are done in camera, where he's actually capturing something kind of stunning and amazing and bizarre on camera with very little tinkering after the fact. It was hard for me to explain that because his filmmaking style is so unique, but what you end up with is this unique world that feels kind of the same way a dream does. And not in the way that dreams do in other movies, not where it's like, oh, we're in a dream, isn't this a dream-like? No, there's a bizarre, almost unsettling, yet can't quite put your finger on what's actually happening and why things are so displaced and strange. It's that way through almost the entire movie, and while I've seen other movies do it, no one quite nailed the experience the way Michel Gondry did with this flick, making it a just one-of-a-kind experience. I mean, it's 20 years old now. You guys know I watch a ton of movies, and I've never ever seen anything else like Eternal Sunshine, which is why it makes my number one spot. Don't forget to go check out the Factor link down in the description if you want to start eating healthier like I have, but I will keep making these videos as long as y'all keep watching them. Thanks for watching out this special YouTube list, and you will see me on the next one.